If I haven't turned you into a podcast lover by the end of this video and you're not sold, I'm going to give you your money back, even though I'm not taking anything, nor am I selling you anything. In this video, I'm going to go through 9 podcast recommendations of podcasts that I've personally listened to over the last few years. I started listening to podcasts about a few years ago when I had a commute of about 45 minutes to an hour long. So I thought, how am I actually going to spend this free time and do something worthwhile while I'm just sat there in traffic? So that's when my love of podcasts kind of came into fruition. So hopefully there's something out there for you, whether that's to be entertained, to be inspired, to be motivated, to learn something new, to explore a new idea. It's all there. And the most amazing thing about listening to podcasts is you can be doing it whilst you're going to school, whilst you're coming back from work, whether you're lying in bed, whether you're exercising, walking, doing all the boring household chores, which is when I listen to it mainly. So like dishes, cleaning, folding the laundry. You're learning something new whilst doing really boring things. So it's like 2 birds with 1 stone. Here are all my 9 recommendations, so let's get into it. The first one is Bottom Line, and this is a business-orientated podcast where they pretty much cover any type of topic that is remotely related to business. I am not a business person whatsoever, and you probably never find me watching a video about business, but when it comes to podcasts, you find yourself listening to all these different things that you otherwise wouldn't normally watch. They cover a specific business-related topic each week. So the format of the podcast is a main presenter, and then he always brings with him 3 main guests. So these are people who are kind of experts or professionals in the field of whatever they're talking about. And it's really engaging because it's a conversational style, so you're not being talked at. So I'll give you an example of the type of content. So the other day I was cooking, I was making like a chicken curry or something, and I was listening to supply chain logistics. So basically how goods travel from like different countries and end up on your doorstep. So whatever you've ordered from Amazon or whatever. And apparently the last mile in that delivery process is the most expensive one. So that's a little fun fact. So another episode I listened to was about behavioral psychology in the workplace, or like how businesses use specific psychological tools to try and keep their employees so they don't quit or like resign from the business. The next podcast is Unlocking Us by Brené Brown, and I absolutely love this podcast. It's so inspiring and so motivational, and it's really eye-opening as well. So the presenter, Brené Brown, she's a researcher, has literally spent like decades of her life learning and studying the human emotion and like human experiences and how that impacts on how we live and how we deal with other people. And I actually came across her when I watched a TED talk of her on the power of vulnerability on YouTube, which has like loads of views. I found that she had a podcast, so I obviously had to listen to it. And the conversations that she has with her guests, who tend to be like experts in their field, are really, really inspiring and really thoughtful and very motivating. You know, she talks about mental health, she talks about vulnerability and empathy and all of that fun stuff. Podcast is really calming. It's almost like meditation, and it's insightful at the same time. An example episode is, let me find it. Oh, it's one I actually listened to yesterday. Oh, this was a really good one actually. Invited a kind of researcher, and they were talking about how emotion, like human emotion, really impacts on our cognition. It was really interesting. And I love the fact that when she brings in experts, generally speaking, like a side note, something so satisfying of listening to an expert talk really passionately and enthusiastically about their field of expertise. It's just really satisfying, and I always finish feeling really, inspired and like, ooh, I can do something myself. And also it's almost like when you're listening to these experts having like discussions and like having a conversation, it just feels like you're hanging out with really cool and intelligent people. The next one is The Daily by the New York Times. So this is a kind of a more of a news podcast. So they cover a specific news topic of the day, and they kind of delve into it in more detail in terms of the topic. So I find that I really struggle with watching the news on TV or like on the computer, because it's like 24 hours. There's like so much noise when it comes to news, and there's like headlines, there's like clickbait, and then there's like sensationalism and like shock kind of headlines. And I find that I never get the full story when it comes to whatever news topic is being talked about that day. Again, they bring in like experts and like journalists. Information is more condensed. there's more detail, there's more nuance, and there's more discussion that's kind of covering from all different angles, so you get a much better and like a more balanced idea of what is actually going on. I really like listening to the news in this way because one, it keeps me informed, and two, I'm avoiding just sitting there mindlessly watching the news. And you know how it's 24 hours, we can never avoid the news, so I just get it in bite-sized chunks and then I can get on with my day. And again, because it's quite conversational style, it's really easy to follow. Episodes tend to last about 25 to 30 minutes, so they're not too long. And that brings me to my next one, which is very similar but is more global, and that is The Intelligence by The Economist. This one is a very similar format, so they always cover one topic each day, and again, they go into it in a lot of detail. But the difference with this podcast is they cover more obscure kind of news topics, things that you wouldn't otherwise hear on the news, or talking about countries that wouldn't otherwise make it on the news. It's more global and kind of more international in terms of things that they talk about. Their slogan, which pretty much sums it up, is we dig past the headlines to get the stories beneath and to stories that aren't making headlines but should be. And again, it's a very similar kind of length, so about 25 minutes per episode. So an example topic is why Japan's population is declining and their birth rate is actually going down. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. And the next podcast, which is my absolute favorite, is Criminal. And this is the actual podcast that got me into podcasts in the first place. So this one is a true crime podcast, but not the typical true crime podcast where they kind of focus on the crime. This one is more about the impact that the crime has on people, so the people affected by the crime and the people who are committing the crime. Kind of delves into that, like the wider issues, so societal issues like human nature, legal issues, the justice system, social injustices. There's a mix of like really light-hearted topics, which are actually quite funny sometimes, and then there are more serious kind of topics. And the way in which the episodes go, it's almost like a story, and it's kind of like semi-journalistic because there's like interviews, questions, and the main presenter, Phoebe Judge, has the most soothing and relaxing voice I've ever heard on someone, and their audio is so crisp. There is about 150 episodes, I think, and I've probably listened to maybe 149, if not all of them. And I listened to all of them while I was commuting to work. So I used to commute like an hour or so each way. So I've had plenty of time. And again, the episodes are about 25 minutes to 30 minutes long. So I'll give an example of some of the episodes, which are probably actually one of my favorite ones. And one of them is Just Mercy. So this one was a African-American lawyer who basically tries to get people off death row. And a lot of the time, these people who are on death row, this is in the US, have been falsely accused, or they've experienced some kind of social injustice or like a legal, judicial kind of problem. He talks about his like mission and what he does, and yeah, really interesting, very thought-provoking. You learn something along the way as well. And a little fun fact, the show was coming live to London, but unfortunately the lockdown happened, so that was all cancelled. So hopefully, fingers crossed, once it's all over, I might be able to attend. So the next one is 99% Invisible, and this podcast is all about things that we don't really notice when it comes to design around us in the world. So whether that's like architecture, whether that's how cities are planned or certain objects. And it's super interesting because they delve into one topic, explore the history of it and why it was made like this and that type of thing. I'll give an example of one of the topics that they've discussed, and this is actually probably one of my favorite ones. And it was about something called hostile architecture. So if you think about like public seating, like benches in parks or any type of seating in like city centres, there's something called hostile architecture where the design is made in such a way where the seats are made uncomfortable to be sat on for long periods of time, or they make them in such a way where people can't lie on them. Apparently it's to help avoid antisocial behaviours of people like loitering or like homeless people like sleeping on the seats. So that was really interesting. One of the other favourite episodes I really liked was one about chair design, which seems like the most boring and most random topic to ever listen to. But when you're doing something, washing the dishes, you listen to anything. This one was really interesting because it was talking about the history of chair design and how designing chairs is actually not just about sitting on it, but more about status symbols. So for example, in offices, office chairs are made to reflect different statuses or different like ranks. So like a manager chair would be like massive and like, you know, looks really overbearing compared to like a secretary chair or like a receptionist chair, which is like small and less visible. There's a whole thing about status dependent seats or chairs. These things that you learn about, like really random facts. I always think to myself, I might actually use this information in the future, like, I don't know, some general knowledge quiz competition or something about chairs, and then I'll be like, yes, I know about this because I listened to an episode about chairs and I know all about it. And the next one is TED Talks Daily. I'm pretty sure everyone knows what a TED Talk is. The best thing about this podcast is they're much more condensed, so they're only like 15-20 minutes each, and it's about any topic that you can imagine. So they always cover a specific topic each day, anything that's remotely interesting, whether that's science, business, politics, psychology, you name it. So the next one is Hidden Brain. And this is a really good podcast. It's kind of similar to Unlocking Us by Brené Brown. And this one essentially talks about, I think the summary is way better explaining if I was to try it. This podcast tries to reveal the unconscious patterns that drive human behavior, the biases that shape our choices, and the triggers that direct the course of our relationship. The really good thing about this podcast is, although some of the topics are quite academic, they provide like real life context. The other day I was actually listening to an episode where they were talking about conversation and how the way we speak, so the way we emphasize certain words, our tones, words that we use, how we say it, when we say it, what we say, has such a big influence on the way we have conversations with other people. A new really interesting point that we're talking about was the difference in conversation when it comes to men and women, and how that affects kind of marriage and like relationships. And if you know these little patterns that people use, then that helps you kind of communicate better. So it was like super interesting. And the last one, which probably is really random but kind of taps into my secret desire to publish a book in the future one day, is In Writing. And this is a podcast basically about writing. The main presenter, Hattie, invites kind of different type of writers, so journalists, people who write fiction, people who write non-fiction, poets. She asks them questions of how they write, what is the actual process of writing, how do they come up with an idea, you know, where do they write, how do they think about certain topics, and just a general kind of writing techniques. And I just find it really interesting to kind of get them behind the scenes when it comes to how books are made and like how they actually go from drafting all the way up to kind of publication. I find that now when I'm reading myself, I'm like noticing these things. I'm like, oh, okay, so the writer used this because they wanted to convey that. So yeah, I just find it interesting. The conversations are always really engaging. You know what? I might actually write a book in the future. It's one of those things that's on my bucket list. So you've heard it here first. So yeah, that was everything. Hopefully you will have an idea of what kind of podcast you want to listen to, or you found some inspiration in some of the ones I've recommended. Please do let me know in the comments if you end up listening to any of them. Like always, if you took something from this video, please like the video, subscribe to the channel because it really helped me grow, and I'll see you in the next video.